Thomas stood at attention outside the grand entrance of Windsor Castle, his polished boots reflecting the morning sunlight. For 12 years, he had served as a member of the Queen's Guard, and every single day he wore the same precious item. Pinned to his uniform, a silver cross that had belonged to his grandfather during World War II. The cross wasn't just jewelry to Thomas. It was a symbol of courage, faith, and family honor that had been passed down through 3 generations of military men. His grandfather, William, had carried that cross through the beaches of Normandy during D-Day. The old man used to tell Thomas stories about how he would touch the cross before every battle, whispering prayers for protection and strength. William had survived the war, returned home to marry his sweetheart, and lived to see his grandson follow in his footsteps as a protector of the realm. When William died, he left the cross to Thomas with a simple message written on a piece of paper tucked inside the jewelry box. Wear this with honor, serve with courage, and remember that true strength comes from protecting those who cannot protect themselves. Thomas touched the cross now as he watched the crowds of tourists gathering outside the castle gates. Children pressed their faces against the iron bars, trying to get a better look at the famous guards in their red uniforms and tall black hats. Parents snapped photos while tour guides explained the history and traditions of the Royal Guard. It was a peaceful morning, and Thomas felt proud to be part of something so important and respected. But among the crowd of innocent tourists and excited families, one person had very different intentions. Jake Morrison lurked near the edge of the group, his eyes focused not on the castle or the ceremony, but on the guards themselves. More specifically, he was studying their uniforms, looking for anything valuable that might be easy to grab. Jake was 25 years old and had spent most of his adult life getting into trouble. He had been arrested for theft several times, though his wealthy father always managed to get him out of serious consequences by hiring expensive lawyers and paying off victims. Jake's family owned a chain of luxury hotels, and he had grown up with everything money could buy. But instead of appreciating his privileged life, Jake had developed a sense of entitlement that made him believe he deserved whatever he wanted, whenever he wanted it. When his father finally cut off his credit cards and kicked him out of the family mansion after his latest arrest, Jake had turned to petty crime to maintain his expensive lifestyle. He targeted tourists, stealing phones and wallets. But lately, he had been looking for bigger scores. As Jake watched the guards, he noticed the silver cross on Thomas's uniform catching the sunlight. Even from a distance, he could tell it was real silver, probably antique, and definitely worth a good amount of money. Jake had learned to spot valuable items quickly during his criminal career, and something about this particular piece caught his attention. It looked old and well-crafted, the kind of thing that collectors would pay serious money for on the black market. Jake spent the next hour observing the guards' routines, noting when they changed positions and how close civilians could get during certain times of the day. He noticed that Thomas seemed particularly attached to the cross, touching it frequently and treating it with obvious care. This told Jake that the item was probably even more valuable than it appeared, and definitely worth the risk of stealing. Supper. Morning ceremony proceeded as usual, with tourists watching in fascination as the guards performed their traditional duties. Thomas felt the familiar sense of pride and purpose that came with representing his country and serving the crown. He thought about his grandfather and how proud the old man would be to see him standing guard at one of the most important buildings in England. The cross seemed to warm against his chest, as if carrying the spirit and strength of all the men who had worn it before him. As the crowd began to disperse after the ceremony, Jake started moving closer to the guards. He had a plan forming in his mind, though it was risky and would require perfect timing. He knew that if he got caught stealing from the Royal Guard, the consequences would be severe. But Jake had always been impulsive and had never been good at thinking about long-term consequences. All he could see was the potential money he could make from selling that silver cross. Thomas was greeting some of the tourists who had stayed behind to ask questions about the Royal Guard and its history. He enjoyed these interactions, especially with children who were fascinated by the uniforms and traditions. A little girl asked him about the various pins and decorations on his uniform, and Thomas was explaining their meanings when he noticed a young man approaching from his peripheral vision. Jake had decided to make his move during this distraction. He figured that while Thomas was focused on talking to the tourists, he could get close enough to grab the cross and disappear into the crowd before anyone realized what had happened. Jake's heart was pounding with adrenaline as he pushed through, the remaining tourists getting closer and closer to his target. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the castle courtyard. Neither Thomas nor Jake realized that this peaceful Tuesday morning was about to change both of their lives forever. Thomas continued answering questions from curious tourists, occasionally touching his grandfather's cross out of habit and thinking about the legacy of service he was proud to continue. Jake crept closer, his eyes fixed on the silver cross, and his mind focused on the money it would bring him. In just a few moments, a split second of violence would shatter the peaceful morning and set in motion a chain of events that would test everything both men believed about honor, justice, and redemption. The sacred cross that had survived the beaches of Normandy and symbolized 3 generations of courage was about to become the center of a story that neither Thomas nor Jake could have imagined when they woke up that morning. Without warning, Jake lunged forward through the crowd of tourists and grabbed Thomas around the shoulders. The attack was so sudden and unexpected that Thomas didn't have time to react before Jake's fingers found the silver cross and yanked it hard from his uniform. The chain holding the cross snapped with a sharp metallic sound that seemed to echo across the courtyard despite all the noise from the shocked tourists around them. Time seemed to slow down as Thomas watched his grandfather's precious cross disappear into Jake's clenched fist. For a moment, the experienced guard couldn't process what was happening. In 12 years of service, nothing like this had ever occurred. Tourists sometimes got too close or asked to touch the uniforms, but no one had ever actually attacked a member of the Royal Guard in broad daylight with hundreds of witnesses around. Jake didn't waste a second after grabbing the cross. He shoved Thomas backward, causing the guard to stumble and nearly fall, then immediately started running toward the castle gates. His expensive designer sneakers gave him good grip on the stone. Courtyard and his years of playing sports in expensive private schools had kept him in decent physical shape. But what Jake hadn't counted on was the training and determination of a royal guard whose family heirloom had just been stolen. Thomas recovered his balance and immediately began pursuit, shouting into his radio for backup while running after the thief. His heavy boots and formal uniform weren't designed for chasing criminals, but Thomas was driven by something much stronger than physical comfort. That cross represented everything he valued most in life: his family's honor, his grandfather's sacrifice, and his own commitment to protecting what was sacred and important. The tourists in the courtyard erupted into chaos as they realized what was happening. Children started crying, parents grabbed their kids and pulled them back against the walls, and dozens of people started taking videos with their phones. Some tourists tried to block Jake's path, but he pushed through them roughly, knocking over an elderly man and causing a woman to drop her camera, which shattered on the stone ground. Jake reached the main gates and darted into the busy London street beyond, with Thomas only about 20 feet behind him. The morning traffic was heavy, and Jake took a dangerous chance by running directly into the road between moving cars. Horns blared and brakes screeched as drivers swerved to avoid hitting the running criminal. One taxi came so close that Jake could feel the wind from it as he barely made it to the other side of the street. Thomas followed without hesitation, his training taking over as he navigated the traffic more carefully, but just as quickly. Other guards were now responding to his radio calls, and he could hear sirens in the distance as London police began converging on the area. But Jake had gotten enough of a head start that he was still ahead, and he clearly knew the neighborhood well because he immediately turned down a narrow alley that most tourists would never have noticed. The alley was filled with garbage bins and delivery trucks, making it difficult for both men to maintain their speed. Jake's expensive clothes were getting dirty and torn as he scraped against brick walls and jumped over obstacles, but he kept running with the silver cross clutched tightly in his right hand. Behind him, he could hear Thomas's heavy breathing and the sound of his military boots pounding against the pavement. Jake emerged from the alley onto another busy street and made a quick decision to jump onto a city bus that was just pulling away from a stop. He managed to grab the back door and pull himself up onto the steps just as the bus accelerated into traffic. For a moment, he thought he had escaped, but Thomas appeared at the bus stop just seconds later and managed to flag down a police car that was responding to the emergency calls. The chase continued through the winding streets of London, with Jake switching from the bus to the underground subway system. He had grown up in the city and knew it well, using his knowledge of shortcuts and hidden passages to try to lose his pursuers. But Thomas was working with an entire network of police officers, security guards, and even some helpful civilians who had witnessed the theft and wanted to help catch the criminal. Jake finally thought he had lost everyone when he emerged from a subway station in a completely different part of the city. He was exhausted, sweating heavily, and his expensive clothes were ruined, but he still had the silver cross. For the first time since grabbing it, Jake took a moment to really look at what he had stolen. The cross was beautiful, and obviously bold, with intricate engravings and what appeared to be a small inscription on the back that he couldn't quite read in the dim light of the subway entrance. But Jake's moment of victory was short-lived. As he tried to catch his breath and figure out his next move, he heard the sound of approaching sirens getting closer and closer. The London police had set up a perimeter around the area, and they were systematically searching every building, alley, and hiding place. Jake realized that his knowledge of the city had helped him temporarily, but it wasn't going to be enough to escape the massive manhunt that was now underway. Thomas, meanwhile, was working with Detective Inspector Sarah Collins, a 20-year veteran of the London Metropolitan Police who specialized in theft cases. Collins had been impressed by Thomas's detailed description of the suspect and his ability to stay calm under pressure, despite having something so personally important stolen from him. She could see the pain in the guard's eyes every time he mentioned the cross, and she was determined to get it back for him. Jake made one final desperate attempt to escape by stealing a bicycle that was chained up outside a coffee shop. He used a rock to break the chain and started pedaling frantically through the narrow streets, but the bicycle was old and slow, and he was too exhausted to maintain any real speed. Within minutes, he could see police cars appearing at both ends of the street he was on, closing in on his position with nowhere left to run. As the reality of his situation finally hit him, Jake stopped pedaling and looked down at the silver cross one more time. For the first time since stealing it, he began to wonder about its real significance and what it might mean to the guard he had taken it from. Jake dropped the stolen bicycle and slowly raised his hands as police officers surrounded him from all directions. The chase was over, and he was completely trapped with nowhere left to run. Detective Inspector Collins approached him carefully, her experienced eyes taking in every detail of the young man who had caused such chaos at one of London's most important landmarks. Jake was breathing heavily, his expensive designer clothes torn and dirty from the chase through alleys and subway tunnels. His face was flushed red with exhaustion, and sweat dripped from his forehead as he stood perfectly still with his hands in the air. But what struck Collins most was the look in his eyes. Not the defiance or anger she usually saw in criminals when they were caught, but something closer to confusion and maybe even regret. Thomas arrived at the scene just as the officers were, placing handcuffs on Jake. The guard's uniform was also disheveled from the chase, and he was still breathing hard from the adrenaline and physical exertion of pursuing the thief through half of London. But his focus was entirely on one thing: getting his grandfather's cross back safely. Collins carefully removed the silver cross from Jake's clenched fist, noting how tightly he had been holding it even while surrendering. She examined it briefly, before handing it back to Thomas, watching as the guard's entire body seemed to relax the moment the precious heirloom was back in his possession. Thomas held the cross gently, checking to make sure it hadn't been damaged during the theft and chase. Jake watched this exchange in silence, and for the first time began to understand that he had stolen something much more valuable than just an expensive piece of jewelry. The way Thomas handled the cross, the obvious relief on his face, and the careful way he examined every detail made it clear that this item had deep personal significance that went far beyond its monetary value. At the police station, Jake was processed through the standard procedures for arrest: fingerprints, photographs, and paperwork. But Collins was intrigued by certain aspects of the case that didn't fit the usual pattern of theft crimes. Jake's clothes and accessories showed that he came from money, yet he had risked serious criminal charges to steal a single item from one of the most heavily guarded locations in London. During the initial interview, Collins learned about Jake's background: the wealthy family, the private schools, the previous arrests that had been handled quietly by expensive lawyers. But she also sensed something different about this particular crime. Jake seemed genuinely shaken by the experience, not just because he had been caught, but because of something deeper that he was struggling to understand himself. Thomas gave his statement to the police, describing exactly what had happened and providing background information about the stolen cross. He explained that it had belonged to his grandfather, a World War II veteran who had carried it through some of the most dangerous battles in European history. The cross wasn't just a family heirloom. It was a symbol of courage, sacrifice, and the military tradition that Thomas was proud to continue. Collins made note of these details, recognizing that the emotional impact of the crime was just as important as the legal aspects. She had handled thousands of theft cases during her career, but it was rare to see a victim who was so deeply affected by the loss of a stolen item. Most people were upset about losing valuable things, but Thomas's reaction suggested something much more profound. Jake spent his first night in jail in a small cell with concrete walls and a narrow window that barely let in any light. He had been in police custody before, but never for something this serious, and never with the weight of knowing that his actions had caused genuine pain to another person. He kept thinking about the look on Thomas's face when the cross was stolen, and the obvious relief when it was returned. The next morning, Collins returned to interview Jake more thoroughly. She wanted to understand what had motivated him to commit such a risky crime, especially given his privileged background and the fact that he could have simply asked his family for money if he needed it. Jake was initially defensive and tried to downplay the significance of what he had done, but Collins was skilled at getting people to open up about their real motivations. Collins showed Jake the police report that included Thomas's detailed statement about the cross and its history. As Jake read about his grandfather's service during World War II, the battles he had fought, and the meaning the cross held for 3 generations of his family, something began to change in the young man's expression. The arrogance and entitlement that had driven him to commit the theft started to crack as he realized the true magnitude of what he had stolen. The report described how Thomas's grandfather had been part of the D-Day landings in Normandy, one of the most dangerous and important military operations in history. He had carried the Silver Cross through months of combat, touching it before every battle and crediting it with bringing him safely home to his family. The cross had been a gift from his wife before he left for war, and he had promised to return it to her personally no matter what happened. Jake learned that Thomas's grandfather had indeed returned home safely, but had carried the emotional scars of war for the rest of his life. The cross had helped him through the difficult years of adjustment after the war, and when he passed away, he had specifically requested that it go to Thomas as a symbol of the family's tradition of military service and protection of others. Reading. These details had a profound effect on Jake that he hadn't expected. He had grown up with every material advantage but had never really understood concepts like sacrifice, honor, or serving something greater than himself. His grandfather had been a wealthy businessman who had made his fortune through shrewd deals and aggressive tactics, very different from the kind of heroism that Thomas's family represented. For the first time in his life, Jake began to feel genuine shame about his actions. This wasn't just about getting caught or facing legal consequences. It was about realizing that he had stolen something sacred from a person who had dedicated his life to protecting others. Jake started to understand that there were things in the world that couldn't be bought or sold. Things that had value beyond money because of what they represented about human courage and love. Collins observed these changes in Jake's demeanor throughout their conversation. She had seen many criminals express regret when they were caught, but it was usually about the consequences they were facing rather than the harm they had caused to others. Jake seemed to be genuinely grappling with the moral implications of his actions, which was unusual in her experience. As the interview concluded, Jake asked Collins if it would be possible for him to speak with Thomas directly. He said he wanted to apologize and try to explain that he hadn't understood what he was really taking when he grabbed the cross. Collins was surprised by this request, as most criminals preferred to avoid contact with their victims, but she agreed to ask Thomas if he would be willing to meet with the person who had stolen his grandfather's precious heirloom. Thomas was surprised when Detective Inspector Collins called to tell him that Jake Morrison wanted to meet with him personally. The guard's first instinct was to refuse. He had his grandfather's cross back safely, and he saw no reason to face the criminal who had caused him such anguish. But something in Collins's voice suggested that this request was unusual, and she seemed to think the meeting might be worthwhile for reasons she couldn't quite explain. After thinking about it overnight, Thomas agreed to the meeting. He was curious about what could motivate someone from such a privileged background to commit such a desperate and risky crime. Thomas had grown up with very little money, working multiple jobs to support his mother after his father died when he was young. He couldn't understand how someone who had been given every advantage in life could choose to steal from others. The meeting was arranged to take place at the police station, in a small conference room with Collins present to monitor the conversation. When Thomas entered the room, he was struck by how different Jake looked from the arrogant young man who had attacked him at the castle. Jake appeared smaller somehow, his expensive clothes replaced by a standard prison uniform, and his earlier confidence completely gone. Jake stood up immediately when Thomas entered, his hands shaking slightly as he struggled to find the right words to begin. Thomas sat down across from him at the small table, wearing civilian clothes instead of his guard uniform, which somehow made the conversation feel more personal and less formal. Jake started speaking in a voice barely above a whisper, his eyes focused on his hands rather than looking directly at Thomas. He began by trying to explain his background, the wealthy family, the private schools, the sense of entitlement that had been ingrained in him from childhood. But as he talked, Jake realized how shallow and pathetic his excuses sounded when compared to what he had learned about Thomas's family history. Thomas listened quietly as Jake described his previous arrests and how his father had always used money and influence to protect him from serious consequences. Jake explained that he had never really faced meaningful punishment for his actions, which had led him to believe that he could take whatever he wanted without worrying about the impact on other people. When Jake finally worked up the courage to look Thomas in the eyes, he saw something he hadn't expected. Not anger or hatred, but a kind of quiet sadness mixed with disappointment. Thomas's expression reminded Jake of his elementary school teachers when they had tried to help him understand right from wrong before he had become too cynical and entitled to listen to their guidance. Jake then began talking about what he had learned from reading the police report about Thomas's grandfather and the history of the Silver Cross. He described how shocked he had been to discover that he had stolen a war veteran's medal, something that represented genuine heroism and sacrifice rather than just expensive jewelry. Thomas was surprised by the depth of Jake's knowledge about his grandfather's military service. Jake had clearly spent considerable time researching the D-Day landings and trying to understand what his grandfather had experienced during the war. Jake spoke with genuine respect about the courage it must have taken to storm the beaches of Normandy, knowing that many of the soldiers would not survive the battle. As Jake continued talking, Thomas began to see glimpses of the person this young man might become if he could move past the privilege and entitlement that had shaped his early life. Jake's questions about military service and sacrifice showed an intelligence and curiosity that had apparently been misdirected rather than completely absent. Jake asked Thomas to tell him more about his grandfather's experiences during the war and about what it meant to carry on a family tradition of service and protection. Thomas found himself sharing stories he rarely told anyone, describing how his grandfather had struggled with nightmares and guilt after returning from combat, and how the Silver Cross had helped him remember that his suffering had been for a worthy cause. Thomas explained that his grandfather had taught him that true strength wasn't about power or dominance, but about using whatever abilities you had to protect people who couldn't protect themselves. The Royal Guard position wasn't just a job for Thomas, it was a way of continuing his family's commitment to serving something greater than their own interests. As Thomas spoke, Jake began to understand the profound difference between inherited wealth and inherited values. Jake's family had given him money and possessions, but they had never taught him about concepts like duty, honor, or sacrifice. Thomas's family had given him something much more valuable, a sense of purpose and a code of ethics that guided his decisions even when no one was watching. Jake asked Thomas why he had agreed to this meeting, and Thomas admitted that he wasn't entirely sure himself. Part of him had been curious about Jake's motivations, but he was also starting to think that maybe his grandfather would have wanted him to try to help a young man who was clearly lost and searching for direction in his life. Thomas told Jake about some of the other challenges he had faced growing up: the financial struggles after his father's death, the pressure to give up his military ambitions and focus on making money, and the times when he had been tempted to take shortcuts or compromise his principles for personal gain. Thomas had made different choices than Jake, but he acknowledged that it was easier to do the right thing when you had positive role models and a strong moral foundation. Jake listened to these stories with growing fascination and respect. He had never met anyone like Thomas, someone who had faced real hardships, but had used those experiences to become stronger and more committed to helping others rather than becoming bitter or selfish. Jake began to wonder what his life might have been like if he had grown up with the kind of guidance and values that Thomas had received from his family. Near the end of their conversation, Jake made a request that surprised both Thomas and Detective Inspector Collins. Jake asked if there was any way he could learn more about military service and what it meant to dedicate your life to protecting others. He said he wanted to understand what real honor looked like, not just read about it in books or police reports. Thomas was quiet for a long time before responding. He could see that Jake's interest was genuine, but he also knew that changing a lifetime of bad habits and selfish thinking would require much more than just good intentions. Thomas finally said that he would think about Jake's request, but that any real change would have to come from Jake himself through his actions over time, not just his words during a single conversation. As the meeting concluded, Jake thanked Thomas for taking the time to speak with him and for helping him understand what he had really stolen when he grabbed the Silver Cross. Jake said he knew that his apology couldn't undo the pain he had caused, but he wanted Thomas to know that. The experience had opened his eyes to a completely different way of thinking about life and what it meant to be a good person. 3 weeks after their meeting at the police station, Thomas received an unexpected phone call from Jake Morrison. Jake was calling from prison, where he was being held while awaiting trial for the theft of the Royal Guard's cross. His voice sounded different from their previous conversation, more humble and uncertain, but also more genuine than Thomas had ever heard him speak. Jake told Thomas that he had been spending his time in prison reading every book he could find about military history, particularly focusing on World War II and the experiences of soldiers who had served with honor and distinction. He had also been writing letters to veterans organizations, asking them to help him understand what real service and sacrifice meant in practical terms. Thomas was intrigued by Jake's apparent commitment to learning and changing, but he remained cautious. He had seen too many people make promises about reform when they were facing serious consequences, only to return to their old behavior once the immediate crisis had passed. However, something in Jake's voice suggested that this transformation might be different and more lasting than typical jailhouse conversions. Jake explained that he had also been trying to understand his own family history and why he had grown up with such a distorted sense of values. Through conversations with his father during visiting hours, Jake had learned that his grandfather had actually served in the military during the Korean War, but the family had never talked about it because his grandfather had been ashamed of some things that happened during his service. This revelation had shocked Jake because it meant that his family did have a military tradition, but it had been buried under years of focusing on business success and financial achievement. Jake's grandfather had earned several medals for bravery during combat, but he had also been involved in some controversial incidents that had haunted him for the rest of his life. Rather than dealing with those complicated feelings, the family had simply stopped talking about military service altogether. Jake said that learning about his grandfather's hidden military background had made him realize that his criminal behavior might have been partly due to growing up without any real understanding of honor, duty, or service to others. His family had taught him that success meant accumulating wealth and power, but they had never given him examples of people who had used their abilities to help others or protect important values. Thomas listened to Jake's explanations with growing interest and some degree of skepticism. He appreciated that Jake was trying to understand himself better, but Thomas had learned from his own military training that real change required action, not just self-reflection and good intentions. Thomas decided to test Jake's sincerity by proposing a challenge that would require genuine commitment and sacrifice. Thomas suggested that if Jake was serious about learning what service meant, he should use his time in prison to help other inmates, rather than just focusing on his own education and rehabilitation. Thomas pointed out that there were probably other prisoners who couldn't read well, who were struggling with addiction, or who needed help preparing for life after release. If Jake really wanted to understand what it meant to serve others, he could start by using his education and privileges to help people who had fewer advantages than he did. Jake was initially hesitant about this suggestion because it would require him to interact with prisoners who came from very different backgrounds than his own privileged upbringing. Many of the other inmates were suspicious of wealthy criminals who they saw as getting lighter sentences because of their family connections and expensive lawyers. Jake was afraid that trying to help other prisoners might make him a target for violence or manipulation. But as Jake thought more about Thomas's challenge, he began to see it as an opportunity to prove that his transformation was genuine rather than just another way of trying to get favorable treatment from the legal system. Jake started by offering to help fellow inmates write letters to their families, since many of them had limited writing skills but wanted to maintain contact with loved ones on the outside. Jake's first attempts at helping other prisoners were awkward and sometimes unsuccessful. His privileged background made it difficult for him to relate to people who had grown up in poverty, faced discrimination, or struggled with addiction and mental health issues. Some inmates took advantage of his naivety, asking him to write letters that were actually attempts to coordinate illegal activities or manipulate family members for money. However, Jake gradually learned to be more careful and discerning about who he helped and how he offered assistance. He began working with the prison chaplain to identify inmates who were genuinely trying to improve their lives and reconnect with their families in positive ways. Jake discovered that many of his fellow prisoners had served in the military before their criminal convictions, and these veterans were often eager to share their experiences and wisdom with someone who was genuinely interested in learning about service and sacrifice. Through these conversations with imprisoned veterans, Jake began to understand that military service wasn't just about heroic battles and medal ceremonies. Most of the day-to-day reality of service involved routine duties, following orders, working as part of a team, and putting the needs of the group ahead of individual desires. Many of the veterans Jake met had made mistakes during their service, or afterward, but they had learned valuable lessons about discipline, loyalty, and taking responsibility for their actions. Jake also started participating in a prison program that provided job training and education assistance to inmates who were preparing for release. He used his business knowledge from his privileged upbringing to help other prisoners understand how to write resumes, prepare for job interviews, and develop realistic plans for supporting themselves legally after leaving prison. This work was challenging because many of the inmates had criminal records that made it extremely difficult to find legitimate employment, and some had been in prison for so long that they were unfamiliar with basic technologies and social changes that had occurred while they were incarcerated. Jake had to learn patience and persistence as he helped people navigate systems that seemed designed to keep former prisoners trapped in cycles of poverty and recidivism. Thomas received regular updates about Jake's activities in prison through Detective Inspector Collins, who was monitoring Jake's case as it moved through the legal system. Collins reported that prison staff and other inmates had noticed significant changes in Jake's behavior and attitude, and that his efforts to help others appeared to be genuine, rather than calculated attempts to impress judges or parole boards. After 2 months of consistent effort to help other prisoners, Jake wrote another letter to Thomas describing what he had learned from his experiences. Jake said that working with fellow inmates had taught him more about real courage and resilience than all his previous education combined. Many of the prisoners he was helping had faced challenges that made Jake's privileged problems seem trivial by comparison. Yet they continued trying to improve their lives and reconnect with their families despite enormous obstacles. Jake told Thomas that he was beginning to understand what his grandfather's military service had really meant and why. His family's focus on wealth and status had left him feeling empty and directionless, despite having every material advantage. Jake said he was starting to see that true success meant using your abilities to help others and contribute to something larger than yourself, rather than just accumulating possessions and social status. Thomas was impressed by the specificity and depth of Jake's insights, and by the consistency of his efforts to help other inmates over an extended period of time. Thomas decided that Jake's transformation might be genuine, and he began to consider what kind of guidance he might be able to offer to help Jake continue growing and changing even after his release from prison. 8 months after the theft of his grandfather's cross, Thomas stood outside the prison gates waiting for Jake Morrison to be released. The young man who emerged looked completely different from the arrogant criminal who had attacked him at Windsor Castle. Jake had lost weight during his incarceration, but more importantly, he carried himself with a quiet dignity that replaced his former swagger and entitlement. Jake approached Thomas with obvious nervousness, uncertain how to greet the man whose life he had disrupted so dramatically. Thomas extended his hand for a simple handshake, noting how Jake's grip was firm but respectful, without the aggressive dominance he had displayed during their first encounter. Jake's eyes met Thomas's directly, showing none of the shifty evasiveness that had characterized his earlier behavior. During Jake's time in prison, Thomas had visited him twice more, impressed by the consistency of Jake's efforts to help other inmates and his genuine commitment to understanding what service and sacrifice really meant. Thomas had also spoken with prison staff, fellow inmates, and even some of the prisoners' families who had benefited from Jake's assistance with letter writing and job preparation. Thomas had arranged for Jake to stay in a halfway house that specialized in helping former prisoners reintegrate into society rather than returning to his family's mansion where he would be surrounded by the same influences and temptations that had led to his criminal behavior. Jake had initially been reluctant to give up the comfort and luxury of his family's wealth, but he had come to understand that real change required him to build a new life based on his own efforts and values. Jake's first job after release was working at a veterans support center that provided services to former military personnel who were struggling with homelessness, addiction, or mental health issues. The work was difficult and often heartbreaking, but Jake found it more meaningful than anything he had ever done during his privileged upbringing. He was particularly effective at helping veterans navigate bureaucratic systems and access benefits they had earned through their service. Many of the veterans Jake worked with had stories that reminded him of Thomas's grandfather, men and women who had served their country with honor but struggled to readjust to civilian life afterward. Jake learned about the hidden costs of military service that weren't visible in medals and ceremonies, the nightmares, the survivor's guilt, the difficulty maintaining relationships, and the challenge of finding purpose after leaving the structured environment of military life. One veteran Jake worked with closely was Robert Chin, a former Marine who had served 3 tours in Afghanistan before being medically discharged after losing his left leg to an improvised explosive device. Robert had fallen into homelessness and alcohol addiction after struggling to find work that accommodated his disability and gave him the sense of mission he had felt in the military. Jake spent countless hours helping Robert fill out disability benefit applications, practice job interview skills, and connect with other veterans who had successfully transitioned to civilian careers. But more importantly, Jake listened to Robert's stories about his military service and the brothers he had lost in combat. These conversations helped Jake understand that real courage wasn't about dramatic heroic moments, but about continuing to serve others even when you were dealing with your own pain and struggles. Through his work at the Veterans Center, Jake also met Sarah Martinez, a former Army medic who had started a nonprofit organization that provided job training and mental health support to female veterans. Sarah had heard about Jake's background and was initially suspicious of a wealthy criminal who claimed to want to help veterans, but she gradually came to respect his genuine commitment and willingness to do unglamorous work without seeking recognition. Sarah became an important mentor for Jake, teaching him about the practical challenges of running a nonprofit organization and the importance of listening to the people you're trying to help rather than assuming you know what they need. She also helped Jake understand that his privileged background could actually be an asset if he used his business knowledge and family connections to raise money and awareness for veterans' issues, rather than trying to hide from his past. 6 months after his release from prison, Jake made a decision that surprised everyone who knew him. He enlisted in the British Army as a private soldier, starting at the bottom of the military hierarchy despite his age and education. Jake's family was horrified by this choice, unable to understand why he would give up his comfortable life to serve in what they saw as a dangerous and poorly paid profession. Thomas was also surprised by Jake's decision to enlist, but he understood the motivation behind it. Jake had spent so much time learning about military service and sacrifice that he felt he needed to experience it himself to fully understand what it meant. Jake also wanted to prove that his transformation was complete and permanent, not just a temporary response to getting caught and punished for his crimes. Military training was incredibly difficult for Jake, who had lived a soft and pampered life before his imprisonment. The physical demands, strict discipline, and constant scrutiny from drill instructors pushed him to his limits and beyond. But Jake's time in prison had taught him how to persevere through discomfort and frustration, and his work with veterans had given him a deep appreciation for what he was trying to achieve. During one particularly challenging week of training, Jake received a package from Thomas containing a letter and a small gift. The letter described how proud Thomas's grandfather would have been to see Jake's transformation from a selfish criminal into someone dedicated to serving others. The gift was a simple silver chain, similar to the one that had held Thomas's grandfather's cross, along with a note explaining that Jake needed to earn his own symbols of honor through his service and sacrifice. Jake treasured that letter and chain more than any expensive gift he had received during his wealthy childhood. He wore the chain throughout his military training as a reminder of the debt he owed to Thomas and the commitment he had made to live differently. The chain was empty, waiting for Jake to earn something worthy of hanging from it through his own actions and choices. After completing basic training, Jake was assigned to a unit that specialized in humanitarian missions and disaster relief operations. His first deployment was to assist with flood relief efforts in a remote region where his unit helped evacuate civilians, distribute emergency supplies, and rebuild damaged infrastructure. Jake found the work exhausting but deeply satisfying, knowing that his efforts were directly helping people who were facing life-threatening emergencies. During that deployment, Jake's unit was called upon to assist with the evacuation of a village that was threatened by rising floodwaters. Jake volunteered to stay behind with a small team to help an elderly man who had refused to leave his home because he couldn't bear to abandon his disabled wife. Working through the night in dangerous conditions, Jake and his fellow soldiers managed to safely evacuate the couple just hours before their home was destroyed by the flood. When Jake returned from that deployment, Thomas was waiting at the military base to greet him. Thomas had brought his grandfather's cross with him, and for the first time, he allowed Jake to hold the precious heirloom. As Jake examined the intricate engravings and felt the weight of the cross in his hands, Thomas told him that his grandfather would have been proud to serve alongside someone who had found the courage to change his life so completely. Thomas then presented Jake with a medal that had belonged to Jake's own grandfather from the Korean War. A medal that Jake's father had finally retrieved from storage and asked Thomas to give to his son. Jake's father had also included a letter apologizing for never teaching Jake about their family's military heritage and expressing his pride in the man his son had become. As Jake pinned his grandfather's medal to his uniform, he realized that he had finally found the sense of purpose and belonging that had been missing from his privileged but empty childhood. He was no longer the entitled criminal who had stolen a sacred symbol from a good man, but a soldier who had earned his own place in a tradition of service and sacrifice that connected him to something greater than himself. The transformation was complete, but Jake knew that it was really just the beginning of a lifetime commitment to serving others and living with honor. The cross he had stolen in a moment of selfish desperation had ultimately led him to find his true calling and become the kind of man worthy of wearing his own grandfather's medals with pride.